What makes an enemy believe they are being haunted by a ghost? And how does a single, silent figure move across a battlefield so deadly that entire companies were brought to a stop? This is the story of a Marine sniper whose presence became more terrifying to the Japanese than the artillery above him. A man they never saw, never heard, but always feared. In September of 1944, the Pacific was entering one of its bloodiest phases. The island of Peleliu, a small spot on the map, held an airfield the American command believed essential for the push toward the Philippines. The Japanese defenders had dug deep into coral ridges, creating tunnels, caves, and firing positions that could survive almost anything. The Marines were told the island would fall in a matter of days. What awaited them instead was a battle so intense that it stretched into weeks of heat, thirst, and constant danger. Henry Hank Bailey was 21 years old when he stepped onto the beach with the Marines of the 1st Division. He was tall, quiet, and calm, a man people often overlooked until he was needed. Back home, he had been known for his steady hands and his ability to observe details others ignored. In the Marine Corps, instructors spotted that same talent. He was selected for scout sniper training and excelled without ever raising his voice, finishing each exercise with a level of patience unusual for a young man heading into war. When Bailey arrived on Peleliu, the heat hit him like a wall. The ground was so hot that Marines learned not to touch it with bare skin. The coral rocks cut through boots. Smoke drifted across the beach, where the first waves had been pinned down by machine gun fire. Bailey moved forward with his rifle tight to his shoulder, studying the ridges rising in front of him, knowing snipers could be watching from any shadow. Hours later, as the Marines pushed inland toward the complex ridge system called Bragol, Bailey was given his first assignment. Japanese infiltrators were slipping through the lines at night, attacking isolated Marines, sabotaging positions, and disappearing back into the caves. Bailey was told to stop them. He didn't ask questions. He gathered his gear, checked his scope, and waited for nightfall. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped slightly, but the silence became sharp. Bailey lay flat inside a shallow coral trench, letting his breathing slow. The moon cast thin light across the battlefield, cutting shadows into long shapes. He heard the faint crunch of footsteps, slow and careful. Minutes later, a Japanese soldier appeared, moving between boulders toward a Marine position. Bailey fired only once. The sound was soft, swallowed by the ridge. The soldier collapsed silently. No one else reacted. Bailey remained still for more than an hour, watching, waiting, letting the darkness move around him. The next morning, he reported the kill and was immediately sent back out. The Marines had trouble locating enemy officers directing fire from hidden caves. Their positions were too well concealed for infantry to spot. Bailey was told to move alone along the base of the ridge, observe, and take any opportunity he found. He crawled for hours through coral dust, moving inches at a time. The heat rose from the ground like breath. His palms became raw from gripping sharp rocks. At last he saw what he was looking for, an officer leaning out from the narrow cave entrance, pointing down at Marine positions and calling orders. Bailey adjusted his scope. He waited for the man to show himself again. When the officer leaned forward a second time, he pressed the trigger. The man fell backward into the cave. Bailey slid slowly into a new position before anyone could locate him. Days passed with the same rhythm. Bailey moved at night, hid during the day, and took only the shots he knew would matter. Word spread among Marine units that a sniper was clearing paths through the ridges, hitting targets no one else could even see. Bailey never spoke about it. He simply took new orders and disappeared again into the coral maze. The Japanese, however, noticed something far more unsettling. Bodies were found at dawn without any trace of who had killed them. Shots came from angles they couldn't predict. Their runners, scouts, and forward observers began dying in silence. Survivors believed multiple snipers were operating, but it was only Bailey. They started calling him a ghost because no one ever saw him move. Marines hearing prisoners talk later repeated the same phrase. The ghost hunts at night. During one-night patrol, Bailey crawled across a razor-sharp ridge toward a position where Marines had taken heavy fire earlier. The area was quiet now, too quiet. Bailey stayed low, letting the moonlight guide him. Suddenly, he heard faint rustling behind a rock formation. He froze. A Japanese soldier crawled out of a crevice carrying grenades and moving toward a group of wounded Marines resting in a shallow dip. Bailey didn't hesitate. One shot ended the approach. He stayed in place for nearly an hour afterward, scanning for others. When none appeared, he withdrew silently, leaving only footprints the wind erased. The next morning, Bailey was tasked with something even more dangerous. Japanese snipers had found elevated positions inside narrow cave pockets along the ridge walls. Their fire pinned down entire companies. No one could locate them long enough to return fire. Bailey volunteered to attempt it alone. He climbed the ridge at dawn, using broken coral and tree roots for cover. The sun reflected off the white rock, making his eyes sting, but he adjusted his scope and scanned the dark holes cut into the cliff.
After an hour of waiting, he saw a flicker, a tiny glint of metal deep inside one of the shadows. He steadied his breathing. The distance was far, and the target barely visible, but he waited for the slightest movement. When a shoulder shifted inside the cave, he fired. A second glint appeared in another cave. He shifted, adjusted his angle, and fired again. This time, a rifle dropped out of the hole and clattered onto the rocks below. Bailey withdrew before anyone could sight him, slipping back toward Marine lines while the ridge echoed faintly with distant shouting. By the end of the first week, many Marines were exhausted. Water was scarce. Temperatures stayed high even at night, but Bailey remained steady, continuing his slow, methodical work. One of his longest crawls came during a mission to eliminate a Japanese radio operator hidden deep near the center of the ridge system. The operator was coordinating artillery strikes on the Marines advancing through the valleys. Bailey began his approach at midnight. He moved only when clouds covered the moon, stopping each time light returned. 6 hours later, just before dawn, he reached a point where he could see the operator adjusting his equipment. Bailey took the shot and then held his position, listening for movement. When none came, he crawled back along a different path to avoid detection. As the days passed, the Marines pushed deeper into the ridge system. Bailey continued taking precise shots that opened small windows of movement for infantry squads, allowing them to advance through narrow passes or secure caves that had been too dangerous hours earlier. He rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. His uniform was often soaked with sweat and dust, and the sharp coral left long scratches on his arms and legs, but he stayed focused. One afternoon, as the Marines reached a section of interlocking caves, they were pinned down by crossfire coming from multiple angles. Bailey moved to a flanking position along the ridge wall and found an angle that allowed him to see the faint outline of a rifle barrel protruding from a hidden firing slit. He waited for the soldier inside to fire again, exposing just enough movement to confirm the spot. With one steady shot, the firing stopped. Minutes later, he located a second position and repeated the process. The Marines advanced. Peleliu was not a short battle. What was expected to take a few days stretched into weeks. Bailey's work continued, sometimes in daylight, sometimes in near complete darkness. He operated without a spotter most of the time, choosing silence over teamwork, because even a whisper could reveal his position inside the coral maze. Many of the kills he made were never officially recorded. Marines often found bodies later with no idea who had been watching from the rocks above. Near the halfway point of the battle, Bailey had one of his closest calls. He was crawling through a narrow gap between two ridges when a grenade rolled toward him from behind a boulder. He had just seconds. He pushed himself backward, letting the blast hit the rocks instead of his body. Shrapnel tore into the ground beside him, but he remained unhurt. Bailey circled wide, climbing the ridge from another angle. Moments later, he spotted two Japanese soldiers moving toward the same gap, likely searching for him. He steadied his rifle, fired twice, and slipped away before more could arrive. As the battle continued, Bailey noticed the changes. Japanese fire seemed less organized. Officers were harder to find. Night infiltrations dropped. Marines advancing through the ridges noticed fewer ambushes. The Ghost was doing his work, one silent shot at a time. By late October, the Japanese defense began to collapse. Caves were sealed, ridges cleared, and the Marines finally secured the high ground.
Bailey continued operating until the final days, covering advances, watching trail intersections, and eliminating pockets of resistance that threatened isolated squads. When the fighting finally ended, he had moved across more coral ridges than almost anyone in the division. The radios, the snipers, the infiltrators, the officers, he had seen them and ended them before many Marines even knew they were there. When Bailey left Peleliu, he carried the same quiet presence he had brought with him. He was sent to another unit for the next phase of operations, participating in smaller engagements across the Pacific as the war moved towards its final year. His work remained the same, observing, waiting, and firing only when the moment required it. He survived those operations as well, carrying the lessons of Peleliu with him into every mission. When the war finally ended, Bailey returned home without ceremony. His actions were not widely known. Most of his wartime reports stayed inside military files, and he rarely spoke about what he had done. But among the Marines who fought on Peleliu, there were stories that continued long after the battle. Stories about a sniper who moved without sound, who crawled through caves and ridges as if the island belonged to him, and who appeared only in the aftermath of silence. The Japanese had called him a ghost. His fellow Marines simply called him reliable. Today the island of Peleliu is quiet. The coral ridges still stand. The caves still mark the scars of that battle. But the story of Hank Bailey, remains one of the most remarkable examples of patience, precision, and calm under conditions that broke even the strongest soldiers. Thank you for watching. We'd be grateful if you subscribed. It encourages us to share more untold events from history.